Hi, well, welcome everyone to the salon. I think many of you do know Alison, but I will give her introduction as the clinical professor at NYU Stern and the author of Higher Ground, a new book by the Harvard Business Press about ethical leadership and responsible corporate practices in a period of global instability and uncertainty. Alison brings 25 years of experience advising multinational organizations all around the world. And she's here to talk about both her own personal experience and a tremendous amount of research on how businesses can navigate these complicated questions while upholding values like integrity, social responsibility, and environmental stewardship during this time of incredible volatility where it seems like something new is happening every single day. So I want to start us off with a sort of observation that a lot of people have made, which is that the companies that make the sort of biggest commitments around holding high, levels of social practice in their organization often suffer more scrutiny and more negative publicity if they do anything wrong. You open this book with the story of Starbucks, which for the longest time has been known as one of the sort of vanguard organizations that does right by their employees, gives them stock, gives them healthcare, does all these sort of very progressive things. And yet they came under fire for fighting the unionization of their employees, which is something that pretty much every business that has a union tries to get started will do. I worked at Etsy, and the CEO of Etsy would talk about this as well. Like, if you hold yourself to a high standard, others will also sort of punish you if they see any sort of missteps. So, people respond to that. People say, well, screw that. I don't want to be a part of this. Like, I'm going to do the absolute minimum. I don't need to participate in this if I'm just going to get punished for it. I guess, are we being too hard on businesses, or are we not being hard enough on them?
Hi. Well, hi, everybody. That's such a great opener. And I think Starbucks is such a great example, but just wanted to say hi. I'm really, really happy that you're here. I love the size here because we've actually got a chance to have a proper conversation. So I'm going to certainly talk a little bit, but it would be good if we can open it up and have a discussion in the room. And thank you for coming. It's also my last formal event of the summer. So yeah, are we being too harsh, or are we not being harsh enough is a really good jumping off point. And I suppose the way I would start by answering that question is, do we think the exercise is dividing the world into good companies and bad companies? Because we act a lot of the time as if we do think that's the exercise. I obviously talk about this topic a lot of ethical business, and I get a lot of the same comments over and over again. But something I am asked in almost every interview is, who do you think is doing a good job? Who do you think is a good company? And my answer is, nobody is doing a good job at everything. And that's fine if we understand that and can respond to it and learn from it, but we are behaving as if the exercise is to sort good companies from bad companies. And then even more important, we behave as if we're talking about people that can be good or bad or hypocritical or not. And we talk about what companies do and say and dream and feel and decide and whether companies mean it all the time. And it's actually super weird because yes, there's a legal construct, right? The corporate personhood, which we can talk about and legal people like to talk about. We can have corporate personhood without this becoming an all-consuming metaphor in how we talk about this. And so part of the problem is, I think, well, this has many, many, many unintended consequences, but one of the immediate observations, right, is that a corporation is not a person, it's an open system. It is a system in which humans are negotiating for power and resources and strategic control, and it is not separate from society. So we've got a construct that says this is a profit maximizing black box that acts like a person. You'll very often hear people that don't like business say, if a business was a person, it would be a psychopath. But the reality is a business is not a person. And so that means that we need to have a much more complicated and interesting conversation about what this thing which is quite hard to define, it turns out, what its relationship with society and the environment and our political and judicial system may or may not be. But one of our big problems is we talk about them as if they're a singular entity with a single brain.
Right. I think part of your point is that when I say, are we being hard or not hard on them, that's very person oriented. That's very anthropomorphic. We just want to boil everything down to you're a person.
Who means it? Who's doing a good job? Everyone wants that answer, but we don't necessarily have that answer.
And we make up the lists, and then we do the things.
We do a lot of things. We do a lot of rating kind of work, and we also tell companies a story, or at least responsible business people like to tell a story that if you do the right thing, you'll have a better reputation. You pointed out in your opening that this is not true. And there's lots and lots and lots of data that says if you're an activist, you target the most prominent company, which makes sense, right? You might target an ExxonMobil, but you target a Starbucks, because if you can get Starbucks to move on labor rights, the whole restaurant industry will then be under pressure. So if what you're trying to do is improve labor rights, pressuring Starbucks, which is a leader in many respects, makes sense. They're more likely to listen than a company that's just like, well, fuck you, you know. And that's fine, apart from we're telling CEOs, just do all these ESG things and you'll have a better reputation and everyone will love you. And an overwhelming amount of evidence says that that's not true. But then sustainability people like to say, well, you know, it's so great and it's a win-win and this is all wonderful and why isn't everyone doing it? Well, if it were that easy, everyone probably would be doing it.
Well, this is an interesting bridge because you're sort of talking about these sustainability people who are advising companies and saying that if you do this, it will be good for you. You know, companies hire advisors, sustainability advisors, ESG advisors, and then they will go on to ignore the advice as well. You know, sometimes they take it and it maybe is to their detriment, and sometimes they don't take it also to their detriment. You've had an incredible career. You've worked in so many different areas. Are there examples, you know, you described one, several in your book, but where you gave the advice and you're like, you should really do this. This is not just the right thing to do, but it's good for your business, and sort of saw their mistakes and passing up that advice?
I advised a mining company on its sustainability strategy right before that mining company, about 18 months before that mining company massively fucked up in a really spectacular and high profile way. And in retrospect, there were things, I mean, I know why. And part of the answer was that the new CEO got very focused on the upside of things like green copper and the win-win reputational blah, blah, blah. And so the company focused on that to the detriment of basic things like human rights. And there were other more wonky things. And I mean, you know, I was at a workshop with this company, and something else to just say as an aside is if you work for this company, which had assets all over the world, and there was a call at 2 a.m., you were expected to get up and be on that call. So there was also a certain culture that we could say was a bit of a red flag. But yeah, there are other examples, but that would be a big one.
And I mean, play out the juicy consequence for us, you know, like, did the CEO get fired? Was
the CEO and the person that I did the work for both got fired? Yes.
And does that, in scenarios like that, does that bolster your reputation or does it damage it? Because
it was not particularly known that I was working for them, but I'm sure it would probably cause some damage if we weren't talking about it live, which we are.
Well, on that, with that cue in mind, but I would argue that, you know,
more wine.
we'll get more out of this in a minute. You know, let's get to the core thesis of your book, which is you present a framework for thinking about ESG, which is from the lens of respecting human rights. I don't think most people are thinking, oh, human rights, when they think, oh, necessarily business practice. And there's a specific framework that you're talking about from the United Nations. So you get really crystal clear about this. 2010, 2011, there's a framework that's adopted. Can you tell us about the framework and make the case for us? Like, why is this the way we should be thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a somewhat complicated question to answer, but let's kind of start off by talking about what the case is for other ethical frames, and then what the problem is with those ethical frames. And if I lose my train of thought because I've been on the road for a while, just remind me what the original question is. So we've got a few frames that we could use to say, how can a business make ethical decisions? The obvious one is the law. You focus on shareholder value, you don't break the law. We all know Milton Friedman said this. That is the kind of baseline old-fashioned idea of ethics and compliance. And indeed, there are enormous departments called ethics and compliance focused on the company not breaking the law. I think if anyone in the room thinks about this for a millisecond, we can see that that's not super reliable as an anchor anymore. We've got an issue of both laws don't align. There's an issue with enforcing the laws. We're having a really great week with the Supreme Court. There's an issue of many of these problems that we're dealing with today are collective action problems, so they're not that responsive to national level laws, and then we don't have a global consensus. And then there's just kind of problems with companies ignoring the law because it's easy enough, because there's a lot of plea deals and there isn't really accountability. So that's one problem. There's a bunch of problems there.
Is not good enough.
Law is not good enough. And then there are enormous departments that are called ethics and compliance that say we deflect the regulator. So if you get into trouble, let's say someone pays a bribe, you say, look at my policies, look at my whistleblowing line, look at my due diligence, look at my blah, 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 and then you get let off. So that's the way that works. Then we can think about ESG. And so that's
the sort of second generation.
The traditional idea would be that's about going beyond compliance to do voluntary good things about stuff like climate change and human rights and so on. And that's got a history that we can explore more, but what it says is there are a range of good things we can do, environmental, social, governance initiatives one could pursue, and we select those initiatives on the basis they make or save us money. And so there is then a business case for doing something about climate change because we will cut energy costs or innovate faster than someone else or whatever.
Has happy byproducts.
But it's a win-win. There's no trade-off between maximizing shareholder value and doing these good things for the world. And that's the basis on which you select. There are a huge range of things we could do. We select on the basis that these drive value in some way. And then so there's a huge debate about whether that's quote unquote working, whether that drives alpha, what it does it work? We can go into that. It's somewhat tedious and it causes, it sucks up an enormous amount of energy. To what end? I don't really know. But when you dig into those arguments, a lot of those arguments are sort of reputationally based. So if you do a good job and have a better time horizon, people want to work for you more, people want to buy from you more, people will want to invest in you more. So there's a sort of broad, not all the arguments are like this, but there's a broad social license to operate kind of argument. You are innovating or you are managing risk, but you have a better social license to operate because you're doing this stuff, which brings us back to the Starbucks point, because it's not in fact true. So the consequence, if you say we select on the basis that this drives value, is that you're always reacting. Because another thing we can see if we look out there in the real world is that things are not a problem until they are a problem, and that isn't necessarily super predictable. So using a lot of plastic wasn't a problem until it was a problem. Investing in American pipelines wasn't a problem until it was a problem. Operating in Russia or Israel wasn't a problem until it was a problem. Having a DEI program actually was supposed to have upside until about 5 minutes ago, and then Tractor Supply, which is the sort of story of the day, is dialing that back because it no longer drives value. So if we're anchoring to the market, we're anchoring to the market no matter what. And the consequence of that is, one, that has nothing to do with ethics. That's just reacting to the market. And then two, you're always going to be reacting because the thing is not a problem till it's a problem. So if you're anchoring to the thing being a problem in public perception
of the problem, not just it's really that.
Well, the actual accountability and how we measure what's a good or bad business is a more complicated question. But if we're anchoring to how people are treating the issue, we're lost pretty quickly. So the law's a problem, ESG's a problem. What I like about human rights, and there are still a lot of challenges with human rights, but what I like about it is it's legally grounded, and it says at least this is the role of business, this is the role of government, this is the role of civil society. These are the relative relationships between these institutions. And so it also takes account of the political context in a way that, yes, ethics and compliance does, but it assumes the lawmaker is a sort of neutral, fair party and everything's happening.
This one does
ESG assumes that the market is in some way a driver of something.
Sure.
Human rights is grounded in fundamental ethics, and it's clear about this is the government's job, this is the business's job. That's why I like it.
So with that laid out, I have more questions, but I want to check in with the audience, folks here in the room. Is there anyone who wants to sort of poke on that, or come bring into this conversation in a different way?
This is a question. Based on like your work so far, what do you project in the let's say next 20 to 40 years, right? Given the geopolitical volatility we have in the world, right? We have two different systems in a sense or more, and ethics follows whoever has the most power in a sense, right? And you can correlate that to capital, you can correlate that to technology in today's day and age. So like, what are your thoughts on the relativism of ethics on the business side?
Well, it's a really good question, right? So a lot of the way a lot of the frames that we're taught to use, at least in the US, UK, Europe, come from the late 90s when we had a UN. Now, when I mention the UN in class, my students sneer openly, and they're like, well, the UN. But there was the UN and the IMF, and there was some idea. We also, during that era, had this fantasy that what would happen is we were heading to the end of history. There was this sort of whole idea in the 90s that what would happen is we would all, as Western businesses, go into China and invest in China. And China would economically liberalize, and then it would politically liberalize, and then we'd have the end of history, and everyone would be in a happy liberal environment. Well, it didn't go that way, did it? And so we now have an issue where there's a lot of jockeying for power. I mean, one interesting thing about human rights is Chinese human rights organizations write incredibly critical reports about private prisons, racism, gun deaths, things that they have a point about the US, and we write nasty reports about them, and that's the way it is. So if you're a big multinational, you've got a kind of meta problem of, or a meta question of, if I am a Danish company, do I say Danish norms apply wherever I am with the consequences of that? Or do you say I adapt with the consequences of that? So a case I've been discussing in class, and also I've just been traveling around Europe with my book, so people were also enjoyed debating this, was McDonald's. So you probably know McDonald's, McDonald's is a property business. It's not really and so McDonald's, after October the 7th, the thing that happened in the Israeli franchises were all owned by one business. So they start donating to hospitals and the IDF quite quickly. And then there is upset in Oman and Egypt, and they start donating to Palestinian humanitarian causes. And so then the question is, what should McDonald's do about this issue? Does McDonald's, which arguably ought to be focused on the climate impact of beef, have a dog in this fight? McDonald's did indeed try to keep its head below the parapet, but then there's been so many boycotts in Muslim countries, they have in fact sold their Israeli franchise. So lots of questions about kind of and Unilever used to have this phrase, something like hopelessly global or mindlessly local or something. It might be the other way around, but you get the point. So we've got an issue with how flexible are our norms in a global context. And then we've got, and so that I think is a challenge that human rights, I'm not saying it's gonna solve all these problems, but at least gets us further than we are, at least gets us further than what we've got. I think the other thing to talk about would be AI, and that could be an open discussion. I've just done some training on that on the ethics of AI. I just recorded a thing, and I just wanted to say at the end, we're fucked. There's no taking this training. But
we're going to get to that in a minute.
But maybe there's a few things that you can do. But then there are very profound generational shifts. So if you're a millennial, you're now in your early 40s, we're getting to the point where people that think differently about these topics are starting to come into power in companies. And I think that's extremely interesting. And I think Gen Z in the workplace is extremely interesting.
So
So wait, but one thing, Marcus has a question, so this is gonna be our first time ever doing this.
Yes.
So let's see how it goes. Marcus, would you like
Hi,
to
Marcus.
unmute?
No pressure.
Yeah, yeah, no pressure. Am I on speaker? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good. All right. Yeah, thanks for having me up on the floating screen here. I wanted to ask, you were talking about a lot of these initiatives and the end state of them, it's the market, playing to the market. So much of business I've seen is like very objective, right? You set KPIs, you have, you're always chasing profit or sales, or you're chasing numbers. But a lot of the ethics, environmental diversity, it's much more subjective. And is that like a skill that people in business need to develop? Or like if you set KPIs for diversity ratios, like does that help? Or yeah, what's the way forward? Does there need to be more subjectivity to have a better
Ah.
ethical company?
Well, I mean, I think the market's the first thing to say is I think the market's sort of subjective. So it's another one of those things, like it's really interesting. We talk about people like the companies, we talk about the market like it's like gravity, or like it's some kind of rational force, and then we've got people and emotions and values like the market. But the market shifts with social norms. My favorite story that I use in class, or example, Exxon Valdez, which I think was 1989, so huge oil spill in Alaska Sound, affected Exxon share price about 2%. BP Deepwater Horizon, 2009 or 10, 9, I think, 60% effect on the stock price, and it's never recovered. So that is the reasonable investor's behavior, and how it prices that kind of behavior has moved. And I think it's easy to be despairing. It's easy to be like, oh, the market. An interesting thing about the market is as well, we've seen a real shift to intangible value over the last 30 years. So if you look at corporate valuations in the 20th century, the late 20th century, it's things you can see and touch and feel: cash, buildings, machinery, equipment, inventory, land. Now it's things like IP and brand perception and stakeholder trust and research and development and network effects. And so for better or worse as well, the market is more subject to perception. And so, yes, that's an argument for subjectivity. And then you asked a lot about kind of KPIs. I mean, I've got a lot of opinions about targets and goals and what ESG disclosure will and won't do. It's wonky sort of stuff, but there's plenty of really nerdy reading I can send you on that topic. But if a measure becomes a target, it's then worth gaming, is one thing to sort of say about that right away. I think we overestimate what disclosure and a bunch of KPIs and ESG targets is going to achieve. Yeah. Hi.
yes.
So I was hoping that you could, I'm not sure what the thesis of the book is in terms of human rights. So with Milton Friedman, towards the end of his article, he has that sentence formulation: the social responsibility of a business is to improve its profits,
Increase its profits.
increase its profits, while, and then like
Paying attention to law and the customs of society. He's something like ethical custom,
right.
He says, but he never really talks about it again.
So I'm trying to figure out how you're using human rights in a way that would diverge from Milton Friedman's thesis.
Well, okay, so Milton Friedman, I mean, and this kind of requires getting more wonky and responsible business. So what happened, Milton Friedman writes that article in 1970. Post-Second World War, there's somewhat of a social consensus on what business should and shouldn't be doing. And let's also remember that at that time, business is a lot less globalized. So business as part of the community is not insane as it, I mean, people still talk about business and its community, but like, who's McDonald's community? Do we mean the people living around a McDonald's? Like, this is an incoherent concept, right? But in the 50s, 60s, it isn't. Then there are a bunch, and white collar crime law is not doing a lot around that time either. In the early mid 60s, there are a lot of ethical scandals, price fixing, bid rigging, that kind of thing. In response, CEOs say, don't regulate us. We'll donate to the opera and we'll do CSR programs. And this is kind of the birth of the modern version of CSR. So the idea is we do whatever we do, and then we offset it in some way with a donation to this or that charity. That's the original idea. And Friedman is understandably irritated by that because it is wasting money to fund the opera that you ought to be giving back to shareholders. And he also has a perspective, right? Other stakeholders, which is true in 1970 in America, broadly speaking, are protected by the law. So if you are an employee, customer, if you're a lender, you get interest. If you're a customer, you can take your business elsewhere. If you're an employee, you can go and work elsewhere. Shareholders don't have any rights, really. And so that he's trying to do that, and he's assuming a working legal system where businesses are broadly domestic. And he's assuming a sharp line between business and politics. He's assuming there's no corruption and that the law works to protect other stakeholders, and then business can maximize shareholder value. If all those conditions are true, fine, but they're not true. They weren't true then, and they're certainly not true now. And so, I mean, there are people in ESG, like Tarek Fancy would be a really good example, sort of pop out in 2020 being like, well, ESG will never do anything. We need the law. Well, you know, this is such an obvious point. If the law was working, that would be one thing. Even if the law was working, there is a limit to what we can do about something like climate change on an international scale. And so that's where human rights is, I think, at least a little bit more coherent. Yes, it's still voluntary. Yes, we've still got a problem with accountability for sure. But at least says, what's the role of government? What's the role of business in a more coherent way? Not saying it's entirely coherent, but it's more coherent than ESG and compliance.
Hi. So I work on AI governance. And I'm wondering, in an ecosystem where there's pretty much information asymmetry, so you have people who really understand AI, and then you have people who don't. Those people work for Fortune 500 companies, they're policymakers. How do you think about developing?
How many people do understand it? Who understands
Well, I know when you're talking about ethical frameworks, so the OECD ethical AI principles is something that comes up as some people want to orient around it. So when you think about developing ethical principles, when there's pretty extreme information asymmetry, what tools or systems, or how do you approach this?
I mean, interestingly, I think the big tech companies also base a lot of their work on human rights because it's impact based. It says you consider the impact of a tool before you develop it. A company like a Google or a Facebook, and we can all critique them, but certainly a Facebook or a Google is doing more advanced work on this topic than anyone else. But kind of brings us back to the Starbucks paradox of the most advanced companies are often the ones getting the most flack on a topic. So these companies have bigger exposure, so they're, you know, we can still argue that they're the problem, but they're doing the most advanced work, and it's all human rights based.
I worked at both, and I would say that I don't think that there's rigor, maybe for human rights in specific products, but
now how embedded that is in the wider decision making is kind of the meta challenge for everybody. So you can have, I mean, the meta challenge for everybody is, do we have a department doing a thing, and how then do we get the thing that department's doing embedded in wider business decisions? So it's that I seriously doubt is happening, because these are both advertising based business models and there's too much money in it. But in terms of the actual decision, if you're asking about the decision-making frameworks, there's quite a lot of interesting thinking going on.
So human rights is where we should be orienting.
In my opinion, because its impact, it says you consider your impact on human beings. And I would also argue for treating environmental challenges with humans at the center, because we've tended to treat climate change as a technical challenge. But unless you consider the impact on human society, you won't know what to do about, for example, job losses because of coal, which has obviously then political consequences. So I think we need to have human impact at the center of ethical decisions. you know, so I'm not making arguments about how that's going to magically increase accountability. The argument of the book is, if you wanted to make good business decisions and you were running a business, how would you do this? It's not, and people can say, well, they're not going to do that. I mean, yeah, I don't really have an answer there, but if I think there are people that want to do this, and they're surrounded by an overwhelming amount of bad advice. So at least we can say, if you were trying to do this is better than ESG, it's better than compliance, it's better than reputation, it's better than anything else we're doing. Am I saying it's perfect? No.
Yeah, let's take one more and then we'll kind of keep.
I have a separate question about that later, but just building on this point, like I worked at Meta for a little bit as well, and just like, I mean, the wholesale cutting responsible innovation teams, and you've built in incentives often where if people get to a certain level of power, you actually can't get to a certain level of power retaining a certain sort of, you have to bow to certain interests to even get to certain levels of power in some of these organizations.
True everywhere, right? True everywhere.
And I'm just curious ways to interrupt that dynamic or pierce it that you've seen work. And it might be piecemeal, but I feel like I noticed that so much in these places where you have a leader who's really championing a lot of change, but then there becomes this ceiling or this echo chamber or whatnot. So curious
For
examples.
sure, you know, for sure.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm probably, or I may be, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what people think. I may be over egging this in the book, but one of the things that I think is very, very interesting is what I sort of broadly in talks called leaking is the new whistleblowing. So the rise of strategic leaking, the rise of young people being willing to undercut the narrative. I mean, and Facebook's a prime example, right? You know, we get all the details of, I mean, we care less because we've got bigger problems right now, but Zuckerberg's town hall meeting, Zuckerberg's decisions, we know that they knew about the effect on young girls because of Frances, whatever her name is. Like, we know a lot of stuff because people working at Meta are willing to leak dirty stuff into the public domain. So there is, in a very real sense, and I'm not saying this is happening in a sort of fair, proportionate, reliable way, but there is now a group of younger employees in many, many companies that will undercut the corporate narrative and will, over time, I think, challenge these things. And this is chipping away. Like, it's really chipped away, to take a different example, a firm like McKinsey. So, one, they've just been fined $768 million for working for the FDA and Purdue Pharma at the same time. But two, I'm getting a bit of a sense of a death by a thousand cuts reputationally. We could say the same about the Big Four. We could certainly say the same about Facebook. I mean, you know, people, you know, it's generally not where it's at anymore. So there's something, you know, it's sort of too big to fail because it's got however many billion users, but there's something, its power is, I feel, seeping away in some.
It had a market sort of resurgence. I also worked at Facebook for a period of time, so
Who didn't then?
I know, I'm sorry, disclaimer. Disclaimer, but you know, there was, you know, they sort of, it's not clear that they've sort of lost their command of, you know, hiring ability or other sort of.
Look, you know, we're in a monopolistic society,
Yeah.
and this is particularly the case in tech. But at the same time, they've got less power than they did. But you know, and even, you know, people are
Certainly.
even if we broke up Facebook, would it help? Because as I've already said, Facebook has better practices than a lot of other places. So, yeah.
So I want to change the topic for a minute, and you tell the story about anti-corruption, which is like a more explicit, like bribing is not good, but as any.
Apparently it's fine now. That's a few days ago.
We can talk about that, but you know, and this is personal for me because my wife is currently in Bangkok. She's an artist, and she is taking down an art installation that she had, and you know, Bangkok is known for Thailand is known for having a fairly corrupt sort of business environment where there is a lot of pay to play and sort of that kind of activity between government, the businesses, and so on and so forth. But then you talk about this man and this organization, CIPE, and sort of the work they're doing. And there's another person in a different country who's also sort of showed the way forward for, like, I think the question of like, how do you make an organization be ethical is very hard. I think a lot of what you're trying to say with your book is if you wanted to be ethical, this is how to do it
Yes.
without like
Yes.
completely getting fucked by
Yeah,
everyone
That's
in the
basically what the
market.
book's about.
Right, and so can you tell us about some of the successes that different, entities have seen? Corruption being sort of maybe one good, better example.
Yeah, so there's a chapter about corruption in the book, but it's really the chapter's really about the limits of the law. It's about the limits of legal compliance because I don't know, there's certainly some people that are nerdy and responsible business in here. If you're very nerdy and responsible business, there are a lot of new laws in the EU about human rights and supply chain due diligence and disclosure. And I've observed that a lot of people that care deeply about human rights and climate change and stuff think that these laws are going to do good things. And so many people think that this is an improvement. And my kind of therefore argument here is the legal situation on corruption is like a human rights or climate campaigner's dream. There is incredible international consensus on anti-bribery. There are ideas about what you should and shouldn't do. There's legal consistency. We've come an incredibly long way in 20 years, and yet your wife's still having all these problems. Is anything got any better? So my chapter is really a sort of cautionary tale about relying on the law. And then specifically in the case of corruption, we can kind of make two arguments. So the law says on corruption, what do you do? The law says, what should a company do about corruption? It said, have an anti-bribery policy, due diligence on your third parties, have a whistleblowing line, have rules saying don't bribe, we've got zero tolerance, and that's what you do. We could talk about that for a long time. It doesn't say if you are operating in a country where you're getting stopped at a police checkpoint over and over again, or your ship is sitting in the port and you can't move it out because there are government officials asking for bribes, what do you do? It also doesn't have that much to say about what you do when bribes are legal. What do you do if you can just lobby? What do you do if you can take Clarence Thomas on holiday and everything will be fine? So it's got one problem with it deals with bribery, like it's thinking about envelopes of cash and getting
so explicit.
It's bribery, it's not corruption. It's like saying we'll regulate human rights by saying something about child labor and ignore everything else.
Right.
So it doesn't have a good answer on kind of collective action dilemmas, like what do you do when corruption's really embedded? And then it doesn't have a good answer on things like kleptocracy. Many countries are heading that way. Let's put it that way.
Well, you do mention that like coalitions come together of companies sort of taking a
so
stance.
There's a good news story in Thailand about this, and there's a good news story in the maritime sector about this. But the argument overall is to say, think about the impact of corruption rather than the legal risk to you. So I'm again coming back to this question of your impact.
You're right. And you talked about what happens is that the people in those countries are harmed because they're getting inferior services that have been bribed their way in rather than successfully competed their way.
Right. And so there's a kind of whole debate in corruption about whether there's a distinction between grand corruption or a bribe you would pay to change a business decision. So I bribe you for the inside track on an RFP versus a bribe you pay to get let into hospital or get through a police check, to get something you're entitled to anyway, which is usually called a facilitation payment. And so there's some people say that those are two different things, like the American law, for example, says those are two different things, and that a commercial bribe that you pay to get an advantage is different from I'm paying to get a visa, or I'm paying to get through this thing. That's called a facilitation payment. But many people say that those facilitation payments are just one junior government official will take a cut and feed it up the chain. And so the petty corruption feeds the grand corruption and undermines government capacity and blah, blah, blah. So there's a debate.
So it's certainly not a resolved issue.
No,
yeah,
it's not.
So, okay, let's go back to AI because we can't, internet intellect is, you cannot have a salon without talking about AI. And,
I went to TED this year in April, and it was like 50% of the programming. People were joking on it on stage by the end because it was so absurd.
It's hard, but if you don't talk about it, then what are you saying at this point?
It's a Renaissance poetry salon and only talk.
That's true.
Only talk
Only
20%.
That's right. sorry, your name again was?
Lauren.
Lauren, so Lauren, you kind of broached it, you started this, you opened the door on this with this question of like information gaps between policymakers and perhaps the practitioners. I think one thing that I do think is notable about AI is that there was a sort of call coming from inside the house among some number of practitioners of AI. We have these very public sort of separations. The one of the co-founders of OpenAI has started a new organization that's
Right.
literally called like Safe AI.
There's a really interesting data and society report from 2019 that's not about AI, but it's called Ethics Owners, and it's kind of making that point that I just made about employees, about a lot of people in tech companies in general, they're product developers or they're whatever, and they're going, look at this. And so it's kind of another, and wanting to do something on their own. So it's a kind of another example of how you can't say, we'll stick it in this department and then the problem will be solved.
So I guess my question though is like, do you think, looking at this, is this different, better, worse than other scenarios, right? There are situations where, smoking companies, they were probably the scientists behind that sort of knew something about what was going on,
Right.
but that didn't come out. Or, oil engineers recognizing, the internal papers that never get published or get published much later.
Right.
Is this different when you look at from your vantage point, like, the fact that any sort of engineer can go to another engineer and say, what's your PDO? What do you think the likelihood of all of us being dead in 10 years is? Like, is it 10%? Is it 50%? Like that's even just like a straight up, like, how are you doing? Let's get to know you. Here's my number. What's your number?
Right.
Is pretty
Yeah.
different, I would say, than.
No, I mean, in a way, the analogy with oil is pretty good, and the analogy with cigarettes is not good. That's still a voluntary thing. You can choose not to do. The world's not going to end without, we've got a problem still without oil. So I think kind of data and tech stuff, the analogy with oil is reasonably good, but I think it's more like microplastics.
Okay.
I think it's more like we're all guzzling microplastics.
Right.
It's more like that. Like
Yes.
you can't even go and live in, I suppose you could go and live it. I mean, it's like in everything. You know what I mean?
So, but I guess do you think that, the number of individuals and the amount of sort of efforts that individuals are making in this arena is more sort of more forward than oil or the microplastics? If I don't know.
I mean, the oil companies really are very strategic and think very far in advance and they're not idiots. There are clearly a lot of people worrying about this problem. There's also clearly an exponential amount of greed, and I do not feel
For AI or oil?
AI both. I do not feel particularly reassured about the direction of either. I had a very, 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 very interesting dinner when I was in Europe with a friend of mine who is head of sustainability reporting for an oil major, who was talking about the amount of pressure that the European majors are under to invest in renewables. And one of the problems is renewables is a very, very different business model from oil and gas. And so there's all this political pressure to move into renewables, which is making these companies less profitable, and investors, whatever they say they care about, actually are liking the Exxon and Chevron model, to the degree that this person thought that what will happen is the US majors will acquire the European majors. Or maybe Shell acquires BP and we get some US versus EU oil situation. But just as likely Chevron acquires BP and Exxon acquires Shell, because they just look more commercially attractive. And so the oil companies are not stupid, I'm afraid.
Can I ask a question to the point about whistleblowers? Is there an ethical supremacy in a way? So you have people, I mean, my sense from how you spoke about folks, saying this is problematic, I'm leaving this company, I don't agree with this, is that those people are right and have some special knowledge or have some moral high ground that they're operating off of. We don't know that that's true. So where does the hierarchy of ethics come in, and how do you know what that is, and how do you know who to trust?
Well, I mean, the question of what is an ethical business, we can approach that from a philosophical perspective. We could say, should you be utilitarian? Should you be deontological? Should you think about this, think about that? But I mean, I don't know how useful that is. I've never heard a real business person have that conversation, but you could certainly attack that question in that way and have a debate about whose ethics and.
Well, you could say there should be a marketplace for ethics, right? So these people believe something and they should go off and start their own companies and they should be grounded as.
I mean, as far as I know, that's happening. There's a question then about, you know, if is there a different ethics for a business, a profit-making entity versus personal ethics? That would be another conversation that you could have. Then so it's not really a question that I go, there's a lot of people that lots and lots and lots of things you could read about this, and it's a perennial. I mean, one of the things we read in my class is Cicero talking about these topics. This is not a new conversation.
I guess I'm trying to push you in that we spoke before about something being good and something being bad. And so with AI specifically, you see companies maybe are being framed as bad, and people who are leaving and saying they're doing bad things and we're going to start our own companies. And so is there a reframe that needs to happen around a marketplace, or, you know, not competitive, but different types of ethics being deployed and what that means, rather than good and bad, which is kind of how we started.
I don't see any problem with that if it's coherent and if it's applied and if people can understand. I mean, that's kind of an issue. I mean, I again would say that we can tell what's good or bad by thinking about human rights and human impact, which has a set of fundamental rights that I do not disagree with, thinks about emerging rights, has at least some body of law to think about things like trade-offs between privacy and freedom of expression, which would be a serious issue in the AI context. There is some amount of thinking and some people in tech thinking about these things. It's an emerging topic, I think. So to me, I would say that's pretty clear. If your product is having a negative social impact or a proportion, you know, then we need to think about the scale of the harm and the salience and the attribution and all sorts of things, which human rights frameworks have thinking around this. I would say that's how I would say this AI approach is good, this AI approach is bad. I don't think it's just like, let's just figure it out. It's a matter of opinion. I don't think it's just a matter of opinion. I think it's a matter.
We don't know.
Well, yeah,
AI hasn't been
Right.
deployed.
I think there's a lot.
but we can argue in an abstract way about the first and second order consequences. I mean, the reality of what's going to happen is we will see that happen, and then we will be trying to regulate it on the back end. We hope, if we still have a functioning government somewhere by then, which we may not. But I mean, it's hard for us, any human being, to understand even the first order consequences, let alone the second order. I would again suggest that human rights frameworks have a better conceptual framework than philosophy on this particular topic. But I would be happy to be debated on that point by someone that knows more about this topic than me. Yeah.
So I want to talk about, you've brought this up a few times around one, you know, how things change and how you're teaching students who are like, the UN isn't some model paragon of ethics.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm interested in your observations as an instructor in terms of, you know, there are both young people who are dismayed by what's going on in the world and kind of questioning, like, is all, you know, late stage capitalism is a term to suggest that all business is sort of, you know, necessarily creating, negative outcomes in the world, and yet it is also a huge driver of sort of quality of life improvements that have you know, impacted billions of people.
Right.
So do you, when you work with these students, like, are you trying to, let me see the question. Like, do you see a lot of doom and gloom in the students that you work with? And if so, how do you confront that?
They're pretty nihilistic,
Okay.
especially undergrads.
Okay.
And
Yes.
very hard to impress.
The MBA students are a little bit bought into the.
But actually that's changing now. There's a cutoff, millennial to Gen Z. I feared quite a change. Yeah, they're pretty nihilistic and difficult to impress, I would say.
They're in your class, so they believe.
Well, no, I mean, I'm trying to help them. I mean, I have a very, very strong perspective that you should not teach these topics in a cheerleading way, partly because there's a backlash. And if I'm there going, it's awesome and it's a win-win, stakeholders, that's not going to help them very much. So I try to
You don't
really,
bullshit though, yeah.
I try not to bullshit. We talk about bullshit a lot in class and what bullshit
Corporate
is.
bullshit, yes.
Yes. So I try to equip them with to be able to handle a conversation with someone that disagrees on this topic and to understand what it would mean to, in my opinion, to do a good job on these topics. So, and you know, they're welcome to disagree as all of you.
Yeah, I had a question, and I also want to be like, this question is earnestly curious.
Sure,
And
yeah.
not challenging at all, like I was just kind of curious, and it's like, because I don't want to over determine on one reference in the book. And like you, I was curious about theoretical frameworks, because at one point you mentioned uphold, like in one place, I think. And so, again, I don't want to over determine from that, but I was curious if the epistemic approach was in some ways, or you know what, let me ask this more openly, is I was curious about its theoretical frameworks for your thinking. Is that an okay question?
It's a fine question. I mean, I think it's not a theoretical book, and I was not asked to write a theoretical book, but let's go back to where we started, because it's a good, and this idea of the corporation being like a person that is profit maximizing. And so what comes from that is that what we are doing with what we are naming ethics, business ethics, which is a wide range of functions, is we are trying to defend that profit maximizing conceptual thing, person, whatever we're calling it. It is a black box. It is a profit maximizing black box that has no morals. And what we are doing with compliance is saying, if the regulator comes in and tries to take some of that profit, we will have a defense. We will have policies, procedures, blah, blah, blah. What we're saying in sustainability is we will do voluntary good things and we will talk about them, and that will give us a better reputation. What we're doing in HR is saying if someone gets caught sexually harassing or discriminating, we will make employees sign an NDA and we will force them into arbitration, and therefore we will maximize shareholder value regardless of what happens to that employee. Not to say we will fuck over the employee, but that's basically what we're doing with all these functions. We're trying to defend shareholder value from the incursions of perception, basically. And there's there's a really, really great report about 50 years of Milton Friedman, published by the University of Chicago. And there's an essay in it by a Columbia law professor called John Coffey, who says, it's quoted in an early chapter, it says, can a company owe a fiduciary duty to stakeholders? I'm not going to get the exact quote, but it says, can a company do this? That's a legal contradiction in terms. A company cannot owe a duty to natural adversaries.
Love that.
And I read that and I thought, holy fuck. As far as the law is concerned, customers, employees, and suppliers and communities, we don't know what that is, are natural adversaries to profit maximization.
Yeah.
Right.
So if we think that that is the case, we're trying to defend that notional black box from perception. But if a company is not a black box, it's an open system that sits in other social, environmental, political systems. It doesn't mean it can cut itself off and act like a profit maximizing black box, nor can it take on all those problems. It's an institution, it's a social system in part of other systems. Then what does that imply for how we think about our business ethics? That's the conceptual frame, is that our metaphors are wrong. So the way we talk about companies is completely weird. And if we understand it's a system, we would think about a lot of things very differently. That's it. I mean, it's a pretty simple point. That's the conceptual frame.
And is it okay, follow-up question?
Sure.
Yeah, like curious.
Sure,
Like,
and then
so I'm
I'll
hearing
have
you like
something, yeah.
speaking back is like that, again, reductively, right? Like I know that reductively is that what I'm hearing, and I think I want to make sure that I'm hearing in some ways is like, at least broadly, is kind of the post sort of approach to the episteme, which is in some ways like a relative system that's sort of, right, okay, yeah,
Exactly.
is that fair? Okay.
And so it's more just to say, the book is not really suggesting it's got any answers. It's just to say if we made that shift in how we see the world, then we would ask very different questions of business. We'd be having a very different conversation. One very obvious conversation, we will be saying, rather than saying, as we're saying in the EU at the moment, business is responsible for what goes on in its supply chain and needs to solve child labor in its supply chain, we'd say, what is the responsibility of business in a jurisdiction where child labor is endemic? How far are we expecting Mars to go to solve child labor or deforestation in Côte d'Ivoire? What does that imply about that government? What if that government isn't functioning properly? What does that imply about the profit motive? What does that imply about which actors in this value system get rewards? We would just have a different, we wouldn't be like, no child labor, Mars, you're terrible. Like, we'd be having a different conversation.
Which also seems like the context is like, if cocoa is, we're talking Ghana and cocoa or whatever, then that.
And that's a particularly good example,
Exactly, like,
because if
the
there's any
context,
collective
yeah,
action
yeah.
problem that should have been solved by now, it's cocoa in West Africa.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah,
a
yeah.
small number of brands, there's a small number of governments. Yes, there's a lot of smallholder farmers. They've been working on it for 25 years.
That's
They're
right.
not, Mars is private. If we think a long time horizon's the answer, we should have solved this one.
That's
We
right.
have absolutely not.
Yeah, I fucking love it. So anyway, yeah,
All right.
that's great, yeah.
We're coming in on,
Thank you.
towards the end. I know Anna had a question. I'm wondering if there are others online as well, but yeah.
I had a question about 15 minutes ago, and
It may be about, yeah.
it's kind of a backward tangent, but I'm really curious. Like you said something, I love also the metaphors in business. You know, I'm inter-European, so I see capitalism as applied philosophy. It's very philosophical to me, or even religious in its nature. And
Yeah,
I see,
exactly. But we talk about it like it's like gravity.
absolutely, but you said something about obviously that there is a dichotomy between the millennials and the Gen Z. As a millennial, I deeply have to agree, and then get really confused about 1995 about this whole thing. You don't hear business people talk about utilitarians and Kantians. I hear them talk about this all the time. It's far easier.
No, I mean, they might, Gen Z might be. I just have never heard that in a business context.
Yeah, but I'm telling you that I hear this in a business context as a millennial
Great.
startup all the
Awesome.
time. It's
Awesome.
much easier to have a conversation about Hegel with a millennial startup founder
Brilliant.
than about profit maximization. And I'm
So
really curious.
cool.
You know, we say startup, we say scale-up. We are the corporations of the future if they are taught right. Even if you just end up being acquired or acqui-hired or just hired, your values will build into mainstream culture and how mainstream businesses are run. And I'm really curious whether you think that thinking about business again, maybe after 1.5 centuries, again as applied philosophy, and not nihilism. So this is not the Gen Z.
I mean, that's the sort of thing I think might happen, and that cheers me up as your generation starts. I mean, you're leading your own thing, but your generation's now starting to lead big businesses. How optimistic
is now, you know?
Exactly. How optimistic to be about that is an open. I like to be optimistic because I've not got a lot else to cling to. So I happen to cling to this particular thing. I think it's going to be awesome when you're in charge.
Yeah.
My students seem to think we just all got the old people have just got to die off, and I don't know that that's wrong.
I think it's going to happen, but I don't know.
Wanted to check if there were any questions that come on from the chat, because we'll stay in this room in a few minutes, but if anyone
Doesn't it like it? It looks like
There have been no questions. There was,
we spoke to
Jason.
Marcus already, so and Jason had to leave, but it thanks us for inviting him.
Okay, cool. So then
If you have any other questions, now would be a good time.
Yeah.
let's give online a chance to weigh in again.
I think it's only Marcus who asked his question.
Okay, Marcus has his question. All right, good, thank you. Oh, Marcus is back.
Hi,
Okay,
Marcus.
thumbs up.
All right, let me
Marcus
unmute it.
is our chief experimenter. He once called into my salon online from an airplane.
Oh my
Beautiful.
God.
Marcus, please unmute.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just saying I don't have any more questions.
Okay, no, we just want to make sure. We want to make sure. Thank you.
And we had high hopes for the feature being used again.
Yeah.
No,
Bigger.
audio quality was great. Conversation was great. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks for coming.
Excellent. So we can take maybe one more, and then we'll, continue to have this conversation.
Mingle.
You know.
More wine.
Yes.
I was really struck by your analogy to microplastics. I don't know if you tried that out before.
No, it's only occurred to me privately. It's not in the book. No, but isn't it, right? It's good, right?
No, it's great.
Thanks.
No, and this sort of gets at one of these issues where, I mean, it strikes me that, human rights, for example, it's pretty clear what the effect of an action will be, right?
Well, yeah, first order, sort of.
Sure, first order. With AI, I don't think we even know the first order.
Couldn't
That's-
agree
I'm
more.
like,
Couldn't
it's-
agree more.
You've sort of been, I mean, how does the human rights framework approach something that is, it's so uncertain, right? We don't know if, like to take the microplastics analogy, we don't know if this is gonna be a drug that saves lives or a drug that destroys them. How do we, how, like, what's the-
Yeah,
what's that
but
framework
what's the,
doing?
what, should you, expose a child to these tools and think that when they might think that they're real and we don't, I mean, again, would sort of have the problems, part of the problem seems to be that humans can't tell very easily what's real and what isn't anymore. Seems kind of a problem. So human rights would help with that. Human rights would again center on impact and perception. Human rights would consider these things, but I don't have good answers on I'm pretty worried about it. I think it's really worrying. I think it's really worrying for politics. I think it's really worrying for social cohesion.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I'm just struck. I mean, I have friends who did human rights law and all this
Yeah.
thing, and I just wonder, like, what's the approach? Like, take your example. Oh, if it's clear that the machine is designed to deceive, right, or could be taken to be deceptive, that seems clear. But it seems like you have many more gray areas in the case of AI. And so
and the UN guiding principles, which is only 13 years old, but that was designed with physical businesses in mind.
Right.
I mean, a project I did some work on is Facebook, who has been pretty credibly alleged to have played a causal / significant contributing role in the genocide in Myanmar. Well, one of the fascinating things is never had a physical presence there. No one's in the country.
Mhm.
The content moderators even are in Singapore.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, human rights frameworks are thinking about mining or like agriculture or something with real world impact. So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do, but there's at least a body of law. There's at least some thinking about what are the various trade-offs here that we could build on. I mean, given that otherwise we're starting from where, I don't know. I mean, yeah.
I think that's a potent place to end here because I think it leaves a lot of discussion to be had. So why don't we pause there?
Yeah.
Thank you all for
Thanks
coming
for
to
coming.
the formal side of this salon. Let's stay, let's continue the conversation. And thanks for everyone who tuned in online.